For years, he was just another face in the crowd, overlooked, unheard, dismissed. But one morning, fate placed something unthinkable in his hands. The power of the Prime Minister's chair, if only for 24 hours. Suddenly, every decision, every command, every voice silenced for generations could be heard through him. But there was a catch. His skin color turned that seat of power into a battlefield before he even spoke a word. What happens when a black man holds the highest power for just one day? And the world is forced to listen. He wasn't born into power or privilege. He was born into questions. Questions like why his teacher spoke to him differently than the others, why store owners followed him with their eyes, why job interviews seemed to end before they even began. His name was Jordan, a young black reporter who had learned to carry two lives. The one he showed on camera, and the one society forced onto him when the lights were off. Most days, his job was to cover stories no one else wanted. Flooded neighborhoods, rising food prices, families trapped in endless cycles of broken promises. He listened, he wrote, he reported. But inside, frustration built like a storm. The politicians he covered smiled in front of cameras, yet behind closed doors, they ignored voices like his. Still, Jordan wasn't reckless. He played it safe, kept his head down, stayed professional. Because in a world already ready to doubt him, one wrong move could cost him everything. And then came the invitation. A televised experiment. One ordinary citizen handed the power of the Prime Minister for 24 hours. A chance to prove what real leadership could look like. His name was chosen. The crowd cheered. Cameras flashed. But behind the applause was a shadow. Whispers that he wasn't the kind of man who belonged in that seat. Not with his face. Not with his history. That was the moment his life split in two. The man he had been, and the man the world was about to see. The first steps into the Prime Minister's office should have felt like triumph. The thick carpet, the polished desk, the weight of history resting on a single chair. It was everything Jordan had watched from afar as a reporter. But instead of respect, he was met with stares that sliced deeper than words. Advisors didn't see a leader. They saw an intruder. They whispered, exchanged glances, smirked like it was a joke. Still he sat. His nameplate gleamed under the lights. For 24 hours, this power was his. His first act was simple. Order an investigation into a housing scandal that had been ignored for years, where poor families, mostly black and immigrant, were pushed into unsafe apartments while politicians cashed in. The room fell silent. One minister cleared his throat and said, "Perhaps, sir, that's too sensitive." Another suggested it wasn't the best use of his time. They weren't used to being told their neglect had consequences. Jordan pressed on. He signed orders, dismissed excuses, and forced files out into the open. Calls poured in from citizens who had long been shut out of government halls. Mothers begged for clean water. Workers pleaded for fair wages. Students asked for schools without mold and broken ceilings. For the first time, someone in power was listening. But outside the office walls, the backlash began. Headlines questioned his qualifications. Talk shows mocked his accent, his clothes, even his skin, as though leadership had a color chart. Protesters stood at the gates, some carrying signs that dripped with centuries of hate. "Not my Prime Minister," they chanted, their voices rising louder than the cheers of those who believed in him. And yet, Jordan refused to bend. He toured hospitals where patients lay forgotten in hallways. He cut through red tape that had trapped small businesses in endless debt. Cameras followed him everywhere, recording his every move, but instead of faltering, he grew bolder. For once, the powerless saw themselves reflected in power. But every action carried a price. His phone buzzed with threats. His staff whispered warnings about going too far. Even his security detail began to feel more like surveillance than protection. The walls that once seemed grand now closed in like a cage. Still he pushed, because he knew time was running out. 24 hours could vanish in a blink. He wanted to leave a mark too deep to erase, to prove that leadership wasn't about skin color, but about courage. Yet, as night fell and the weight of the day pressed down, Jordan discovered that change isn't welcomed by everyone. Especially not by those who had built careers out of keeping others silent. What came next would test not only his resolve but his safety. The breaking point came just as the night news broadcast began. Jordan had spent the day tearing down walls that had stood for decades, but those walls weren't about to crumble quietly. Outside the Prime Minister's residence, a mob had gathered. Torches, flags, chants that carried an old hatred dressed in modern clothing. Security scrambled to hold them back, yet the noise pierced through the walls like a drumbeat of rage. Inside, Jordan was handed a stack of reports exposing corruption at the highest levels, proof that could bring down powerful men. He held the papers in his hands, but with them came a choice. Speak and unleash a storm that could crush him, or stay silent and let injustice live another day. Then the glass shattered. A stone had been thrown through the window of his office, landing inches from where he sat. The message was clear. Power was never meant to belong to him. His hands trembled, not from fear of the stone, but from the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. He thought of the faces he'd met that day. The mother holding her sick child, the worker with calloused hands begging for fairness, the student with more hope than food. They weren't asking for miracles. They were asking for humanity. As cameras rolled live across the nation, Jordan stood, gripping the damning files. His voice carried over the chaos outside, steady but burning with fire. He named names. He exposed deals. He refused to bow. For those watching at home, it was a moment that felt impossible. A black man standing in the highest seat of power, tearing down lies that had been protected for generations. But in that moment of defiance came silence. Sharp, heavy, dangerous. Because the real fight was no longer about papers or policies. It was about survival. And survival in that chair came with no guarantees. When the sun rose the next morning, Jordan's 24 hours were over. The chair, the title, the authority, all gone as quickly as it had appeared. But the echoes of what he had done remained. The files he exposed made headlines. Some leaders were forced to answer for years of silence. And the people, those who had long felt invisible, spoke his name with pride, not because he had solved everything, but because for one day they had been seen. Yet the cost was heavy. He walked back into his ordinary life carrying scars no camera could capture. Threats continued. Opportunities closed. Some called him reckless. Others branded him a troublemaker. But the families who had been ignored, they remembered. They knew that even a single day of truth was worth a lifetime of lies being broken. And that is where the real weight of this story lies. Jordan's day in power was never just about him. It was about a system that feared change more than it feared corruption. It was about how skin color still decides who is trusted, who is doubted, who is protected, and who is threatened. One man's 24 hours became proof of something terrifying and inspiring at the same time. Terrifying because it showed how deep the resistance runs. Inspiring because it showed how much difference a single voice can make when it refuses to be silenced. So the question lingers. If one day in the hands of a black man could shake a nation, what would happen if power wasn't temporary? If leadership wasn't conditional? If equality wasn't an experiment? The answer is not for Jordan alone. It's for all of us. This story doesn't end when the video stops. It continues in every street, every school, every workplace where silence still holds power. If this moved you, don't let it fade into the background. Share it. Talk about it. Question it. Because change doesn't begin with governments. It begins with voices refusing to stay quiet. So I'll leave you with this. If one day of truth could shake the walls of power, what could happen if all of us stood up every day together?